In the middle of the, no, at the end of the 19th century, Wales was on the precipice of a major change, a change which, even at that point, no one really knew. The concepts and discoveries and conflicts that were about to come in the century to follow were things that were unimaginable at this point. And the knowledge that they had was really based around what the experience of most of the 19th century was, which was colonialism, conquest, and continuations of a system that benefited the central at the expense of the extremities. Let's talk about it. In this episode, we're going to step a bit beyond the borders of Wales as we know it and into the wider world once again of the 19th century. This is a world of empire, expansion, and contest. The mid to late 1800s were the high tide of British imperialism. Territories were carved up in Africa and Asia. Missionary societies were sent, Welsh preachers traveling across the oceans to try and convert these various populations to Christianity. There were soldiers in Wales that would come to fight in campaigns thousands of miles away from home, and in Parliament, Welsh voices debated whether this expansion was glory or folly. Our story takes us from the mid-19th century to the eve of the Boer War, a period sometimes called the scramble for Africa. As I probably mentioned before, a professor of mine used to call the unseemly scramble for Africa, which I don't think is wrong. But of course, this fight for Africa was just a portion of a fight that went far beyond that continent. At the heart of it, we will of course find Welsh men and women participating as soldiers, politicians, missionaries, and emigrants, shaping and questioning the British imperial destiny. But with all of that, let's start with the global context, shall we? By the middle of the 19th century, Britain was the most powerful empire in the world. Its navy dominated the seas, its industry produced more iron, coal, and other goods than any other nation, and its trade network spanned every continent. The Crimean War of the 1850s had shown Britain's military might, while the Indian Rebellion of 1857 revealed the fragility of the imperial rule and the cost of holding power by force. As the century wore on, new rivals were emerging. France, the old enemy, sought to dominate its own area of Africa and Asia. Germany, now united under Bismarck in 1871, soon turned its own eyes to overseas expansion. They were soon followed by Belgium, Italy, and Portugal, who all jostled for a share. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85 carved up Africa amongst the European powers and symbolized this new era, an era wherein there was a scramble for land, resources, and prestige which went far beyond just simply colonialism for conversion and into colonialism as financial gain, which we should say was pretty much colonialism right from the beginning. For Britain, this scramble was both an opportunity and a challenge. It promised markets, raw materials, and strategic bases, but it also risked overreach and conflict. And in Wales, a land with its own long history of conquest and identity, people debated what empire meant and what role Wales should play in it. As you can imagine, it's a conflictory situation. You have those who are loyal to the British crown and to the empire itself, who are eager and willing to be participants in the ideas that were being pushed forward. The concept of nationalism and patriotism were in full swing at this point. And so even amongst those who we would sometimes argue might be seen as not proponents of this angle, there was a concept and an understanding that it was an important part of the British identity to become rulers of the world, the empire that effectively never set, where day always remained no matter where you were always in daytime in the British Empire. The old saying, as I just misquoted, of the sun never sets on the British Empire. This kind of thinking was key in the late 19th century. The belief that it was the destiny of, and let's just put it this way, of the European nations to conquer the world, to bring everyone either to heel, to fortune, or to conversion, depending on your point of view, into the European mindset. And in that became racial ideas, which then started to sprout about, and these ideas were percolating long before this, but they sort of crystallized as the world gained a different view of life, and how, especially how you would look at, survival and the survival of the fittest, to use Charles Darwin's phrasing. Well, these people took that to another extent. They started to look at societies as survival mechanisms, that you could take the idea of nature and transfer it into cultures and societies and races, and explain that the reason why one was above the other was simply down to the fact that they were better suited and better fit for this. This whole argument, which gets its focus at a time when you have communism arising and the ideas of Karl Marx starting to percolate into society, where you have unions and worker rights and discussions about all sorts of philosophies. You also get this social Darwinism, which starts up, which creates and becomes what we will eventually know as fascism, and especially Nazism, which is the peak of that thought process, that the idea that, one race was better than the other, was somehow more dominant than the other, and was rightfully suited to rule the world. That concept begins in this period. It's a justification, really, to take over countries that you had no business taking over, to getting yourself involved in issues that you shouldn't have, and seeing yourself as the dominant culture, and purposely so. It's why there's been so much backlash against it. It's why, and obviously we all know this, it's the reason why there's so much talk about this idea of domination by Europe and by the North America over other places, and how that has been perceived and envisioned by the peoples they took over, and also by people who weren't in that lineup of being taken over. Think of Japan, for example, which was an area which wasn't defeated, I guess you could say, until World War II ended, and thus had their own situation where American culture became dominant. But even within that, you still have a different situation than you do when you have conquest in the way that empire is formed, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, where so much of it was about enforcing your viewpoint on another nation in a way that effectively eliminates the other nation's culture and understanding. That, it's the reason why French and English are the two most popular languages for many, many years across the world. It explains so much of the problems and the conflict that still exists to this day in these areas. And to be fair, how little ability there seems to be to solve so much of this, and how it just seems to revolve and revolve and continue and continue. And it is not the purpose of this podcast to address everything that's going on, but simply to give it context as we move into a more Welsh perspective. One of the most visible Welsh contributions to empire came through its army. Wales provided thousands of recruits, often from industrial communities where they worked hard and the wages were low. For young men, military service offered adventure, pay, and the chance to see the world. A striking example is Sir Thomas Picton of Pembrokeshire. Though he died earlier at Waterloo, his name continued to echo in imperial military lore, inspiring later Welsh officers. In the colonial campaigns of the 19th century, Welsh-born generals like Sir Henry Brackenbury, born in Lincolnshire but of a family of Welsh ties, had numerous regimental officer campaigns in Africa and India. One particularly celebrated figure was Sir Garnet Wolsey, whose family had come from Abergavenny. Wolsey became one of the most famous British generals of the Victorian era, serving in the Ashanti Campaign of 1873 and 1874, the Zulu War of 1879, and the Nile Expedition of 1880s. His efficiency and discipline gave rise to the phrase, "all Sir Garnet," meaning everything was in order. Wolsey's Welsh roots were often mentioned with pride in local papers, linking the valleys and the towns of Wales with British global wars. Perhaps the most famous moment linking Wales to the colonial battlefield came during the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. This conflict, fought in South Africa, grew out from the British attempts to consolidate control over the region. The Cape Colonies and the Natal were already under British rule, but the powerful Zulu kingdom under King Cetshwayo stood as an obstacle to further expansion. British officials presented Cetshwayo with an ultimatum in late 1878, demanding that he disband his military system. When he refused, war followed. Welsh soldiers were at the heart of it. The 24th Regiment of Foot, known locally as the South Wales Borderers, recruited heavily from the Breconshire and Monmouthshire areas, with their depot that was at Brecon, and by the 1870s were closely associated with Wales. When the regiment was sent to Natal, it carried Welsh men and Welsh pride into one of the most brutal imperial campaigns of the century. The opening battle of the war, Isandlwana, on the 22nd of January 1879, was a catastrophe for the British forces. A force of 20,000 Zulu warriors overwhelmed the British camp of 1,800 warriors and auxiliaries. Among those who died were hundreds of men from the 24th Regiment. The shock was enormous. It was the worst defeat inflicted upon a modern European army by an indigenous force in the 19th century. In Wales, the newspapers carried somber lists of the dead, and chapel pulpits debated the morality of the war itself. Welsh readers encountered first-hand voices from the war almost immediately. The Cardigan Observer on the 5th of April 1879 printed a letter extract from Rorke's Drift, dated the 2nd of February 1879, describing the recovery of the bodies of Lieutenant Melville and Coghill after Isandlwana. Rorke's Drift. A party was sent out yesterday, 5 miles from here, to the spot where those who escaped on the 22nd crossed the river. There they found, lying in the path of the glen 300 yards from the water, were Melville and Coghill's bodies. Melville was lying in his uniform on his back, apparently untouched, and with the breast of his serge tunic open. Coghill was lying a little above him. Higginson, a colonist, tells me that Melville's horse was shot in the crossing the river, and he lost the colors he was trying to save, and asked Higginson to help him. Coghill rode back into the river to help him when his horse was also shot, and they both got up to the bank and sat down, saying they could go no further, and that was the last Higginson saw of them. It was in the aftermath of this disaster that the name Rorke's Drift entered legend. Later, the same day, a small mission station near the Buffalo River, garrisoned by about 150 men, found itself under attack by Zulu forces of 3,000 to 4,000. The defenders included many from the 24th Regiment, and several of them Welsh. You have to understand that even though a lot of these regiments are associated with specific areas, such as Wales, they weren't necessarily made up of all Welsh people. There could be men from other parts of England who were made up this particular regiment. They weren't always assigned to the location. That becomes more common later. But keep that in mind, that there are still Welsh men that are involved here. And over the course of 12 desperate hours, the garrison repelled repeated assaults. 11 Victorian Crosses were awarded for the defense, more than any other in any single action in British history. As the news of Rorke's Drift reached Wales in early 1879, letters from the soldiers in the regiment began to appear in Welsh periodicals. For example, Private Owen Ellis of the 124th, writing to his family in Carnarvon, had letters published in E. Genled Gimrig, described by later historians as the model of their kind. These letters gave vivid detail of war life in the camps and the fear and courage of battle. Welsh language newspapers gave equally dramatic accounts. Banner ach Amserai Gymru, on the 8th of March, 1879, these readers were then told that the disaster at Isan Awan had been partly redeemed by the stand at Rorke's Drift. Quote, there was a reason to hope that the harmful effects of that dreadful catastrophe had been entirely countered by a successful and unwavering resistance made by a small determined band of British in another place. Though close to the dreadful clearing, an act of courage and resolve. End quote. For Wales, Rorke's Drift became a touchstone of pride. Brecon Cathedral eventually created memorials to the fallen of the regiment, and the story was retold in schools and public commemorations. The regiment itself proudly adopted the name South Wales Borderers in 1881, cementing the link between Wales and the Zulu War. Born in Penrose in Monmouthshire, Robert Jones, who served in the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Regiment at Rorke's Drift and was one of those who was awarded the Victoria Cross. He was, in a way, in the wrong place at the wrong time, but achieved something tremendous. But not everyone in Wales saw battle simply as heroism. Liberal MPs like Henry Richard questioned why Welsh soldiers were sent to fight in what he described as, quote, an unprovoked war of aggression, end quote. Nonconformist ministers in the valleys also pointed out the contradiction between celebrating chapels, raising funds for missions in Africa, and young men dying in wars against the African people. For them, the bravery of the soldiers was not in doubt, but the justice of the cause was. This tension defined Welsh memory of Rorke's Drift. On the one hand, it was held as proof of Welsh courage, discipline, and sacrifice within the empire, but on the other hand, it raises questions about the role that a small nation like Wales should play in Britain's imperial wars. This, of course, created more and more questions. If soldiers carried flags, missionaries carried the Bible. The 19th century was a golden age of Welsh missionary activity, and it was deeply tied to the imperial expansion, which, of course, creates conflict in and of itself. One of the most famous was Dr. Thomas Coke, originally from Brecon, who helped establish Methodist missions overseas before his death in 1814. His work laid the foundation that others built upon in the later half of the century. In India, Africa, and the Pacific, Welsh Calvinistic Methodists, Baptists, and others sent missionaries who combined religious zeal with cultural exchange. In 1841, Calvinistic Methodist missionaries to the Khasi Hills in the northeast India began with Welsh missionaries like Thomas Jones, who then introduced Roman script for the Khasi language. We've talked a bit about this in the past. Jones's effort to create a written literature for the Khasi people earned him the title of the father of the Khasi alphabet. While praised at home, his legacy remains debated in India, where missionaries are seen as both educators and agents of cultural intrusion, which you can totally understand on both counts. In Africa, missionaries like William Hughes of Carmarthenshire founded schools that sought to train local leaders in Christian values. In Madagascar, among the Zulu, Welsh Baptists established congregations that blended local traditions with nonconformist hymns. These missionaries often saw their work as distinct from the imperial conquest, but in practice they were traveling under the protection of the British power, and their presence prepared the ground for deeper imperial influence. We can argue about, those who are committed to the Christian cause and how much that cause was linked to British imperial expansion, but it's hard not to note that wherever they went, soldiers usually followed. Religious journals in Wales published glowing reports on mission successes. Chapel congregations raised funds, women's sewing circles collected clothing and supplies, and Sunday schools prayed for distant converts. For many ordinary Welsh people, empire was experienced not through politics or war, but through language of mission, stories of heathen lands brought to Christ. Not all Welsh people went overseas as soldiers or missionaries. Many also went as settlers, carving out new lives in these colonial lands. Of course, the most famous example is Patagonia, which we've discussed in a previous episode, but yet it is far from the only example of this. The Welsh have, in general, sought to go to other lands, and they continue to emigrate from Canada to South Africa and Australia to New Zealand to many, many islands and territories across anywhere and everywhere you can imagine. In coal towns like Aberdare and Merthyr, posters advertising cheap passage to colonial lands promised opportunity and escape from the industrial hardship. By the 1880s, there were Welsh communities in Ontario, Canada, in the Cape Colony, and in Queensland. Some of these settlers became enthusiastic supporters of imperialism, writing home with praise for the British civilizing mission. Others criticized the exploitation of Indigenous peoples, drawing on Wales' own experience in cultural suppression. In Westminster, Welsh MPs and peers played their role in the debates over empire. Among the most enthusiastic anti-imperialists was Henry Richard, the apostle of peace from Tregaron, who's nevertheless engaged in questions of colonial policy as Liberal MP for Merthyr Tydfil. Richard often spoke against the aggressive expansion of colonialism and urged moral responsibility and international arbitration rather than conquest. His nonconformist background made him suspicious of military adventures, and he became a leading critic in wars like the Zulu Campaign, which he saw simply as unjust. Welsh liberals such as David Davies of Llandudno, the wealthy industrialist and MP, were more open to empire. Davies invested in shipping and railway and had benefited from imperial trade. While not an outspoken expansionist, his economic interest aligned with global reach of British imperial power. The rise of David Lloyd George in the 1890s added another Welsh voice. Lloyd George, representing the Carnarvon boroughs, was skeptical of imperial wars and critical of government spending on colonial ventures. He would later become one of the most vocal opponents to the Boer War, but even before the conflict, his speeches revealed a tension between the Welsh radical liberalism and imperial conquest. In the Welsh press, of course, debates raged. Papers like the Western Mail from South Wales often celebrated imperial victories and published patriotic poems, while nonconformist journals like the Welsh Outlook warned of the moral decline and decay and the dangers of empire worship. Of course, not every Welsh voice joined in the celebration of Britain's colonial victories, and from the pulpit and the floor of the Parliament and in radical newspapers there became this steady undercurrent of doubt, a suspicion that empire was not glory but folly and perhaps even sin. Of course, previously we've mentioned voices like Henry Richard, who was one of the earliest fighters against colonialism amongst Welsh MPs, but earlier in the century, Samuel Roberts of Llanbryn Mawr had already laid the foundation for this critique. A prolific writer, the nonconformist minister Roberts attacked slavery, war, and imperial exploitation. His pamphlets, some published in Welsh, others in English, argued that peace was the only true Christian policy. Quote, "It is not the duty of Britain to dominate other nations," end quote. He wrote in one essay, quote, "but to set before them an example of righteousness," end quote. In mining villages and rural chapels, his essays circulated widely, embedding anti-imperial thought deep into Welsh nonconformist culture. Other ministers, such as Michael D. Jones of Bala, also turned their eyes against empire. Jones, a furious independent minister and nationalist, argued that the small nations had a right to cultural survival and self-government. His dream of a Welsh colony in Patagonia, or the Waladfa, was partly a protest against both English domination at home and imperial expansion abroad. By planting a Welsh community in South America, he hoped to preserve the Welsh language and cultural freedom from imperial reach. Ironically, his scheme succeeded only by negotiating with Argentina, another imperial state, a paradox Jones himself wrestled with. Welsh radicals in the labor movement added yet another layer. In towns like Merthyr, Newport, and Runtha, union meetings often featured speeches condemning expense of imperial wars. William Abraham Mabon, later an MP and leader in South Wales Miners' Federation, linked the struggles of miners for fair wages with the wider question of justice. And while not a doctrinarian anti-imperialist, his speeches often reminded working men that the cost of empire was paid by their taxes and their sons. So while much of Victorian Wales may have cheered for imperial victories, there was a persistent counter-tradition rooted in nonconformity and radical politics and working-class experience that questioned whether or not the imperial price was too high. These criticisms, of course, pointed to a deeper contradiction at the heart of Welsh identity. In the age of empire, Wales itself was a nation with a history of conquest. It was one of the first imperial conquests of Britain. Absorbed into England centuries earlier, its language marginalized and its culture often mocked in London papers, and yet Welsh men and women were also enthusiastic participants in Britain's conquest of others. You can see why this conflict was creating issues for so many. Poets and editors gave voice to this paradox. The nationalist preachers like Emrys ap Iwan, or William Evans, writing in the 1880s, railed against imperialism and linked it directly to the suppression of the Welsh language. In his essays, he mocked the idea that Britain was civilizing Africa, asking why London could claim to be protecting Zulu culture abroad while crushing Welsh identity at home. For Emrys, the empire was a machine that devoured smaller nations. In contrast, cultural leaders like Sir Lewis Morris, the Anglesey-born poet, embraced empire as part of Wales's place in the world. His patriotic verse, recited at Eisteddfod, often celebrated Britain's global role and portrayed Welsh soldiers and missionaries as noble actors on the imperial stage. For Morris, participating in empire was a way for Wales to gain prestige. Newspaper editors, of course, also framed the contradiction. Western Mail, firmly liberal unionist by the 1880s, celebrated victories like York's Drift, published stirring tributes to Welsh bravery overseas. Meanwhile, papers like Y Gynllydd Gymraeg and Banarach Amserau Cymru, tied more closely to nonconformist and radical traditions, carried critical letters from soldiers and sermons warning that Britain's conscience was at stake. The same tensions that appeared in the culture at home. At one Eisteddfod in the 1880s, a poet compared the Zulu people to the Welsh, suggesting that both had fought valiantly for their independence against a larger neighbor. Yet, at this very same festival, choirs sang patriotic hymns, celebrating the Queen and the Empire. This duality, this pride and unease, defined the Welsh relationship with the Empire in the Victorian age. For every voice like Emrys ap Iwan condemning imperial hypocrisy, there were others like Lewis Morris finding in empire a stage for Welsh genius. For every radical miner who questioned the cost, there was a nonconformist missionary society raising funds for new schools in Africa and India. The result was that Wales was pulled in two directions: proud contributors to the imperial project and uneasy critics of its moral and cultural costs. And that tension would remain even as the 20th century dawned, and questions of the role of Wales in the imperial circle would continue right up until the beginning of World War II, where we start to see a more nationalist bent to the country really take hold, and a change in entirely how to deal with the idea of being a Welsh person in the United Kingdom, and how to deal and come to grips with the differences of opinion and differences of position of those stances. And we're going to talk a lot about that in the coming weeks and months. I'd like to thank you all for either listening or viewing today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com or on any social media, usually at Welsh History Pod, the only exception being on Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And if you'd like to help contribute to the podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you so much. Have yourselves a wonderful day. We will again talk to you next week. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.